Today is Thursday, November 18th, 2010. My name is Frieda Reitman, and it's my pleasure today to interview Jean Palley at her home in Stamford as part of the Oral History Archive of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. The camcorder operator is Julian Reitman. I have been looking forward to this day. Jean, why don't you tell us a little bit about your birth family? I noticed that both your parents were born in this country.
That's right. And not only my parents, but 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in this country. And my 3 of my grandparents came from the South and had kind of Southern accents, which weren't
You mean from the south
of the United States? Yes. 1 in South Carolina and 2 in Richmond, Virginia. And the 4th one was born in Russia, which seemed like kind of a very strange thing. He still had a little accent, which we couldn't really determine. And my father was born in a town in Florida that nobody had ever heard of until Disney opened a big establishment, and that's Kissimmee, Florida. And he was one of 10 children. My grandfather had a general store there. I've been down there and met with the Historical Society, and I found interesting papers. My grandfather was on the Common Council, and I found minutes of a meeting he went to, and they reimbursed him 50 cents to pay for the hay for the horse to get there. At any rate, so they all seemed to come to New York in about 1900, and they moved there because they were the only Jewish family in Kissimmee, and they wanted their children to marry Jews. And my grandmother had a Bible that showed the birth of each child, and next to each one would tell the Jewish holiday closest to that date. And there was also either a full moon or a half moon. I don't know what that part meant. And there apparently was an itinerant rabbi who would come around. I also understand that my great-grandfather slaughtered the cattle because they were kept a kosher home. But when they moved to New York, they moved to the Bronx, which was rural, and I have notes from my grandmother, beautiful. And she said she had never really lived among Jews before, and she was warned about New York Jews. But she said she found them friendly and so on, everything was fine. And obviously they joined a synagogue because I understand that my grandfather was president of the men's club. My father was a member. He must have been, I don't know, like 12 years old or something like that. And I don't know what happened after that, but they did not stay with the religion. I don't know what happened, but they didn't seem to ever belong to anything after that, and they kind of, people, each aunt and uncle went their separate ways.
Now, when did your father and mother meet, and how
Well,
did
my
they meet?
father and mother were supposedly 3rd cousins. My mother was born in New Haven, Connecticut. Her mother was related to the other grandfather, and she was born in Richmond, Virginia, and married the Russian. His name was Meyer Rubin. And they lived in the Bronx. I think it's the West Bronx. And I remember I lived in Brooklyn, which was my home base, and we used to go and visit them there. And they apparently moved to New York from New Haven, where my mother was born, in about the same time that the other family moved up from Florida. So my parents had occasion to meet and see each other, and they got married. They were married in 1919. And,
Was that part of the family also not very observant?
no,
Mother's family?
that grandmother was more observant. And I didn't get to know as much about that part of the family as my father's family. We seem to be closer to them.
Great.
So,
Do you have any childhood memories now? Your parents are in Brooklyn, right? You were
Yes.
as a little, do you have any
Yeah.
childhood memories and how did you
Yeah.
end up in
Well,
Stamford?
I remember that my grandmother used to say, only the murders were committed in Brooklyn. Why would anybody ever go there? She lived in Manhattan. And I have memories of her coming to visit. She had long hair. My sister especially loved to comb her hair. She would tell stories about her life in the South. And apparently they had some slaves, and she has written her memoirs telling about these slaves that she felt were like part of the family, even though at some point she said she didn't think it was right. And they were good, apparently, to these people. Obviously, they made enough money at the store that the family had. And also, she said they owned a jail. This was funny. I just reread these memoirs, and she said they owned a jail, and that some years before, in the 1940s, she got a phone call from someone down there asking if she would be willing to sell the jail for $10. and she said she didn't, she wasn't the least bit interested. It was probably in terrible shape. She didn't want any connection with it, and they should just do what they wanted with it. So she said, I never heard from them again. So,
Oh.
But anyway, she also talks in her memoirs about the holidays and, you know, observing a lot of the, you know.
Yeah, being Jewish or
Being
not.
Jewish, yes, yes. And
Yeah.
apparently it was no secret, you know, wherever they were.
Do you want to say anything about what your parents did? And
Well,
what
at
their
some
home was like?
point, before my parents were married, my father was interested in ethical culture. He used to go to lectures in New York, and he and my grandmother suggested that my mother and a future daughter-in-law, I guess they were engaged to the brothers, my father and uncle, might benefit from getting involved in Christian Science. So they both sort of dipped their feet into this, and both of them felt that there was something in it that they liked. So they both became Christian Scientists. And I went to a Christian Science Sunday school with my sister, and I went from the time I was 5 until I was 18, when I couldn't wake up on Sunday morning. And besides, we were beginning to kind of make fun of some of the things. I won't go into details about what it's all about, but I have to say, we never needed a doctor. My father never had to pay a medical bill. I saved all that until I got married, and my husband said, if you need a doctor, you're gonna get one. And then the bills came in. I don't know if he regretted it. But, so I had that part. I didn't know a lot about Judaism, but when we moved to, then I got married. My husband's family, my father-in-law was born in Russia. My mother-in-law, and came over as a young man. He fought in the Russo-Japanese War, and was, I have a picture of him being very handsome on horseback. And he escaped and lived in England for a while, and then came over because his brother had come to New York and founded a bank, and added another L to the name Palley. It used to be P-A-L-E-Y, and then it was 2 L's. And so several of them began to come over. It was a big family. And my father-in-law became a builder and would renovate and do stuff like that. And my mother-in-law was born in Lithuania, but came here when she was 2 years old. So she spoke English beautifully, you know. She was the youngest in a family, you know, in those days, very often, if the mother died young, the father married a sister, an unmarried member of the family. And anyway, she was the youngest of the second family. So she grew up in Manhattan, New York City, and she and my father-in-law were married, you know, probably during World War I. And
And was
my
Judaism part of that family?
Yes, but they didn't belong to a synagogue. My husband was supposed to have had a bar mitzvah, and it turns out that he and his father used to go swimming in the pool at the Jewish Center in Brooklyn instead of his going to, so he didn't ever make it. But anyway, over the holidays, we would be there, and you know, I lived a block away from them when my son was born, and so we would see a lot of them. And then when we moved to Stamford in 1948, my son was 2 years old, and we would go into Brooklyn over, you know, for Passover and different things. And I don't remember much ritual. It was mostly the food. And but there were a number of relatives. Some of my father-in-law's older siblings still retained a lot of their living patterns from the old country, so that there were like almost 2 generations in a family.
Right, so you and your husband came to Stamford, I guess, was it because he found a job?
Yes, yeah.
And then your family, so you raised your family in Stamford.
I did.
So
But
let's talk
meanwhile,
about
my
that.
parents had moved to Darien. They said they had always wanted to move there. I don't know why, they never mentioned it to us, but they knew that my sister and I would not want to leave our schools. So they waited until we graduated from college and so on, and then they told us. My father opened a business in Stamford, and my husband went to work for him. Not for a long time, but that's how it happened. He commuted from Brooklyn for a while until this building was put
Now,
up.
where did you go to college?
Went to Brooklyn College.
Okay, so
Right.
still New
Yeah.
York.
Still New York, yes. I was
All right, so
always
when
in
you
New York,
came
yeah.
here, then you also had in-laws nearby? Your parents
No,
were
my
nearby?
parents,
were
yeah,
nearby.
but sadly, my mother became blind. That was the whole thing. My son was an infant. So that changed everything. But so my parents had a house in Darien. They weren't involved in the community in any way. But I was living in Stamford, and I had 2 more children. I had 3 children. After my son, I had 2 children, the second of whom was born in Stamford. The other 2 were born in New York City. And then because at first I didn't know anybody up here, so naturally stayed in the city. My brother-in-law was an OBGYN at NYU, and he was present in the delivery room for the birth of my 3 children. So anyway, back to Stamford. I used to read the Stamford newspaper. I got to be familiar with names. They were either Jewish or Italian. And I got to know all the Jewish names, and I even called the Jewish Center when we would be up here and spend a weekend with my parents and my son. And we decided that we had to belong, and it was going to be a temple. So we went on a couple of outings with Stanford Jewish Center. One was a boat ride and a few things, and we met a couple of people. And one of the people we met was someone who's turned out to be my oldest friend, you know, Bernice Fogel. And we met at a party. They were newlyweds. And Milt had come from Berkman, and we had continued to see each other until we all moved to Stanford and so on. So we decided we were looking around for a Reform temple, which would have been the best place considering my background. So it turned out there wasn't any in Stanford. And there was one in Norwalk. And there were some people in Stanford who used to take their children to the religious school up there. But I felt that if we wanted kids to make friends, it was better to do it in the same community. And there was talk about a Reform temple that might come about in a few years. And what happened is I got involved with the Mental Health Association, and I was on the board, and the rabbi of Temple Bethel, Rabbi Perlman, I got to know him, and my son was then in 3rd grade, or about to be, and I said to him, is it possible for me to send my son to the Sunday school and not be a member of the temple? And he came back and said it would be okay. So my son went there, and he won a prize for academically proficient. And he won a beautiful menorah that we still use every year. But also he was getting $10 off the next year on the tuition that we would have paid. So the next year, Temple Sinai started. So he had that 1 year at Temple Bethel, and then we got involved. And I remember distinctly the night that they had the first meeting to talk about building a Reform temple. It was held, and it was Hartford Electric Light Company, Helco, across from the post office. They had a huge room, and there was something in the paper. If anybody was interested in talking about a Reform temple, to come. That room was packed, and we walked in and saw all these people. I said, I didn't know he was Jewish. I didn't know he was Jewish, and this is the way it went. And by the end of the evening, Harold Sandak was on a committee, along with a number of other people, to develop the structure for starting an organization. And so that was the beginning, and we signed on, and we were among the first members, and eventually, and I got involved in the sisterhood. I was I forget, I think I was a vice president, and my husband was first president of the Brotherhood, became president of the temple later on. I was on the board of the temple for a number of years. We were there.
Where did you meet in the beginning?
We went to, on Grove Street in the Lutheran Church, and it was a charming little place, and it was near Main Street on Grove, and the Lutheran organization was building the church that's now St. John's Lutheran Church on Newfield Avenue. So we bought it from them. There has this group had a finance committee, and they got money from various people, and were able to do that. And
were you involved in
Oh,
bringing in
I
the
was
first
involved.
rabbi?
Well, not personally, but I was involved in a lot of things, and I felt very much a part of it, and so did my husband and our kids too. And we went to all kinds of activities, we made a lot of friends, and really felt a part of the Jewish community, which was really the first time in my life I had ever had that experience. And then Rabbi Marks was our first rabbi, and then later we had Rabbi Silver, and we were pretty close to him, and he married my, let's see, my son got married, and it was an interfaith arrangement. Rabbi Silver came up to do that. And then he also married one of my daughters, another interfaith marriage. And so we, we kept up with them, and
But your children went to Hebrew school
they went,
at
well,
Temple
they
Sinai.
didn't go Hebrew school, but they went to, it was called Sunday school, then religious school. And in those days, bar mitzvah was not one of the common things. Getting confirmed was the goal. And you stayed through, I think it was 10th grade. And that's what my kids did. So that most of the boys did not have bar mitzvahs, and there was no bas mitzvah then. Now, I have 3 grandchildren in Stanford, all of whom belong to Temple Sinai, and all of them, 2 of them had bas mitzvahs and 1 had a bar mitzvah. So things had changed completely in the reform movement by then. And
Now your children went to public school?
yes, yes.
In Stanford?
In Stanford, yeah.
Was there ever any anti-Semitism or anything like that you heard about?
I didn't really encounter that. I'm one of the lucky ones. I know because way back a lot of people did have, in the neighborhoods where they grew up. I didn't realize, I lived in Flatbush, Brooklyn. I did not know that it was known to be a Jewish area. But this is the way I've heard it in my adult life. If you mentioned that you came from Flatbush, they assumed that you were Jewish. There were some non-Jews on a street, and we had a couple of Jewish neighbors, but it didn't really seem to be the most important thing, so we just...
Well, that's an American experience.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
And your children went to college and also?
Yeah, well, they went to, they started, they each went to a preschool, and then, all the way through graduating from high school in Stanford. I have to say that all 3 of them ended up at the University of Connecticut. Oh, well, one of my daughters didn't want to go because her sister and brother had been there, so she ended up at Roger Williams, and then later went back and finished at UConn. So they're
A Connecticut family.
A Connecticut family, because 2 of them married UConn alumni. So sort of all Connecticut. My 2 sons-in-law grew up in Connecticut, farther up the line, but nobody from Brooklyn.
Now, do you want to say anything about your husband? I know that he died very
right,
young.
Yes, and quite a long time ago, unfortunately.
And I'd also want to know about the various things you've been involved with in the community.
Right.
Now, you already said he was involved with the temple. And
Yes, he was very
and so
much
forth.
involved with the temple. He was president and, did a number, and the brotherhood and so on. And and we went to services quite regularly, and were very much involved in everything going on in the temple. And as far as our other lives, he was master of his Masonic Lodge in New York City. And that happened in the 50s. So he used to have to be in New York a lot, wearing his tuxedo at some dinner or other, and I would go in sometimes too. So, but after he finished that, most of the activities were in Stamford, and we would go to a lot of community meetings. We were interested in local affairs, and actually at one point I joined the National Council of Jewish Women. I had a number of friends who belonged, and I was in that for a while. I remember performing a crazy thing in a play, playing a clown, and we were doing some fundraising, and I was in that for a while. And then I took some classes at various silly things. I mean, cooking and sewing and various things. And
What about the jobs you've had? Because I looked over the list and you did a lot
Yeah.
of different things.
well, I was a Spanish major in college, and I was a Spanish translator for a big company for a while. And they asked me if I would go to Cuba. It shows you how long ago that was. And then when I left there, it was time for me to start a family. And so I was home. I got involved in doing some volunteer work. And then when my son started kindergarten, I went to my first PTA meeting, and I raised my hand with a question, and before I know it, I was in charge of publicity. So I stayed, with the schools, and my husband was president of the PTA, and I was a vice president, and we spent a lot of time doing that kind of thing with our kids. And then along the way, I had an aunt who was very involved in the mental health movement. Her sister-in-law was a prominent, wealthy philanthropist and was on the board of the National Association for Mental Health. So she was encouraging me to get involved. I was sort of looking for a niche as a volunteer. So I got involved, and there was a group that had been quiescent during the war and was being revived. So I went. I was recording secretary for years and years.
And is this in
years.
Stamford?
This is in Stamford. And I eventually became president, and then I became, when they decided to hire a staff person, that's what I did. I was, and eventually became the executive director. But there were other, trying to think of the other things I was involved in. I worked for the homemaker service. I was a supervisor for a few years, and then I decided to go back to school while I was working, and I took a job with the Family Service of Westchester. I was the assistant to the executive director, and I started a program at NYU getting a master's in public administration. So I would go in sometimes from there. I worked in White Plains. And anyway, that took me a couple of years, and I got it. And after I got that, I took a job as the director of the WIC program in the Stamford Health Department. And then at some point, I started a business with a friend, and it was called Settlement Services. It was a time that, like, IBM was very involved in moving their employees around, and families were kind of stranded moving into a new area. So this friend and I decided that we could fill a niche. So we set up a business to help the families of relocated employees of a corporation. And as a matter of fact, Helen Uberbacher, you know her?
Yes.
We made her like chief of staff, and I had a lot of wonderful volunteers who would be available if we needed them. Somebody bought a house and we had a full schedule. It was a very exciting time, and that lasted for a couple of years. My friend unfortunately moved to New York, and I didn't really want to run this by myself. I had turned a room in my house into the office. Her husband was an international lawyer, and he drew up all our papers, and my accountant was doing our work, and we had we were throwing business around, and decided to close it down. So that was one little episode. I forget what else I did.
Well, there's something about Meals on Wheels
Oh, yeah,
and
so then
Brandeis
I began
University
driving.
and
Right, Meals on Wheels, and what else?
Brandeis University. Did you belong to
I
that
did
group
belong
of
to Brandeis for a
group?
while, yes.
And
then I got involved in learning and retirement, and so I've been on the program committee for quite a while.
and
I think that's good.
tutoring.
Yes, I still tutor. I tutor through Reading Partners, which is under the auspices of the Jewish Federation of Stanford, New Canaan, Westport, Norwalk, I think it's all one. And it's terrific. It was started by 2 volunteers and has grown so that they cover almost all the schools in Stanford. And it's a very successful program, and we, spend an hour a week with 2 children, half hour back to back, helping them with reading from kindergarten through 3rd grade. And it's been very satisfying and good. And we have an annual breakfast at Agudath Shalom, and have speakers come, and they have some in-service training. They bring in some reading specialists and so on. So it's been a good experience. Unfortunately, Meals on Wheels has gone out. Catholic Family Service took it over, and they're still delivering meals, but not the same group. I was also involved with the United Way for quite a while, because I always worked for an agency that was part of the United Way, and I really liked being with a nonprofit. Oh, I know what I did, I forgot. I became the director of the MS Society of Fairfield and Litchfield County. There were at that time about 200 MS patients in my area. And what I found was I didn't like fundraising at all, and I hated having to even think about raising money. I was more interested in the services we could provide and the research that was being done. But all I found out was every time I sent a letter, I had to ask for money. I didn't like that part. So, I'm trying to think.
Do you want to say anything about your granddaughter, the rabbi?
Oh, yes. P.S. In spite of my lack of a Jewish childhood, I now have a granddaughter who's a rabbi. And she, although she went through Temple Sinai with a Reform background, she became very observant and Orthodox. And since she couldn't be ordained when she decided to become a rabbi, as an Orthodox rabbi, she went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. She was ordained a year ago, last June, and she's now on the faculty of Gettysburg, I think that's the name of it. It's a college in Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania. Oh, I know, it's Susquehanna College, sorry about that. And she's a professor of Jewish studies half-time and a rabbi half-time. And she's enjoying it tremendously, and she's been she has a Hillel house. She worked for Hillel at Oberlin College and so on. And then her sister is now with the Joint Distribution Committee, and she had been with the Jewish National Fund. She's a graduate of American University, so they're carrying on. And these are the descendants of my son, who was married in that interfaith service, and his wife is the mother of the rabbi and the one who's at the Joint Distribution Committee. So that line is continuing. And they are very, they're very much into Judaism and so on, and the culture, and very proud of their heritage, and they'll think it's strange, but probably, although they've seen some of this material.
Oh, come on, everybody is an individual and it's all interesting. Do you have any reflections on having lived so many years in Stamford about the community, Jewish and otherwise, that you'd like to record?
Well, I think Stamford has been a very good, healthy environment for families, and I didn't find that people were segregated that much. There's been a lot of interfaith action. I have to give the clergy here a lot of credit. There's been a strong organization where the clergy people would get together and meet and go to each other's churches and synagogues and exchange time on the holidays and so on. And so everybody was welcome, and they learned a lot about each other's faith and traditions. So it's been a very comfortable environment, and I feel as if my children had friends of both backgrounds, and I don't feel as if they ever were victims of any anti-Semitism, and
Well, Stanford has grown so much since the
Yeah.
time when you came up. It's been a...
that's right, yes, that's right. It's
been
been
a
a time
good-
there were only Jews and Italians. Right.
Now, you had told us that you'd like to add to some of the materials you have, you would like it to be included in the
Okay.
video.
Just,
Unless there's something more you want to add about your life, your family, or the history. Where did so how many generations were born in the United States, your family?
well, I would be the 4th generation.
Okay.
My children would be the 5th, my grandchildren 6th. So,
So why don't we take a look at what these items you'd like to have
Oh,
included
okay.
in this?
just say, that's my elementary school diploma. Yeah, let me see what that one says. Yeah, that's what mental health is, Mental Health Association.
Oh dear. You ready?
Tell us a little bit about some interesting travels you've had and through.
Well, my first trip out of the country was when I left my position with the Mental Health Association. Had a nice farewell, and the next day my husband and I left on a trip to Europe. And we had a great time, and that was our first experience being overseas. And another trip that we took was to Israel and Greece. And we had a fascinating experience. I found that there was some relative I tried to look up. That didn't really work out too well. But we, I think we spent about a week or 10 days there, and thought it was a great experience, and it was unusual to be in a place where everybody is Jewish. So, and I'm sure that's how most people feel if they've gone there for the first time. And we took a number of trips after that. And then unfortunately, my husband passed away in 1982. And I did go on a number of elder hostels with some friends, and went abroad a number of times, and also spent some winters in Florida. And have celebrated some big birthday anniversaries with my children, taking a cruise. There are now probably about 15 in our family. I have 7 grandchildren, 1 married, and some of them have attachments and so on. So as the years go on, I've really traveled less, but have something coming up this winter that I'm going to celebrate another birthday. I don't like mentioning numbers.
Okay, we don't need the numbers.
Right, okay. Yeah. So anyway.
You don't mind the numbers of grandchildren, right?
No, that's
okay.
fine, that's right. And I even can tell how old they are, but that's another story. So, I've gone, also I've gone to Cape Cod. My daughter-in-law has a place up there. I've gone there in the summer for a visit. And my sister lives in near Berkeley in California, so we sometimes go back and forth. And we keep in close touch. And she's lived out in California for many, many years. So.
Why did she go to California while you went
Well,
to Stanford?
Yeah. Her husband was an OB/GYN and believed in group practice way before it was common. And Kaiser Permanente was on the West Coast, and they came looking to New York City and found him, and they moved out there. And then he unfortunately passed away some years ago. He was my advisor in all things medical. Really, I think every family should have a doctor and a lawyer. I once had them, but no more. And but anyway, my sister and I are close, and she's close to my children and to hers, and so on. So we used to think we had a big family, but that's not really true. And I had about 6 or 8 first cousins, and there are a few of us left, and we get together. I have one in Darien, and one who had been living in Morristown, New Jersey. He's now in Naples, Florida. and another one in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So we would try and get together, and we would reminisce about our family, you know, and so on. We had close ties. So,
Those are your thoughts for today.
those are my thoughts, and I thank you both for coming and for the interview and the technical aspect, Julie. And you,
Well, thank you
Frieda.
very much
Yeah.
for participating in our
Yeah.
project.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of the other participants there.
Now
Well,
you can,
how do you get to see them?
well, they're archived at the Jewish Historical Society Archives on Hope Street. Have you
And-
visited it?
No, and you can go and see these?
You can make an appointment when
Uh-huh.
somebody's there, and they do have a place where you can see
I
them.
see, okay.
And you will find them very interesting.
Yeah,
I'm sure
I'm
you
sure.
know a number of the people
Right, yes.
that you
I
would
do.
find.
Yeah,
Yes, they
that
are
sounds interesting,
available.
'cause I know-
Uh,
Well, I went to a meeting at Temple Sinai, brought together a group at Sue Ellen Bache's house. Did you hear about that?
I think I saw it in the literature, yeah.
Uh-huh. And I went, and there was a group, I think like 15 people had shown up, and they were interested in the genealogy. So they went around the room, and people would tell something about their background, and it was fascinating, because each one was so different, you know, and some of them had grown up, of course, outside of New York, and others in New York City, different neighborhoods, and told about, you know, how they celebrated holidays and various experiences they had growing up. And then we went to the Holocaust Museum for a tour. That turned out not to be great.
It's in Washington?
Huh? No, this is the one in New York.
Okay.
You know, it's called the Museum of,
All the way down.
all the way down at the Battery. And then we're supposed to go back once more with a genealogist who's gonna give you hints about how to pursue getting information and stuff. That, Franklin, do you know her? She came and spoke on a Friday night at the synagogue. I forget her first name. Her son is Josh Franklin, that young fellow who's a rabbi at Temple Sinai,
Oh,
and his father is a rabbi too. And the mother has put on exhibits at this museum. And she came on a Friday night and had taken one Temple Sinai family as an example of how to find information. And it was fascinating, and I spoke to her later, and I was telling her about my family and this thing I did. She said, "I've got to have it." She says, "I'm going to be talking to the South Carolina Jewish Historical Society, and I need it." So I sent her a copy, and when we were at the museum and I toured, there was a wonderful exhibit about the Morgenthau family, and having lived in New York, I was interested in that, and she curated it. So she does other things for them, and I don't know whether she's the person they're gonna bring in or not, but then it's her son who's at Temple Sinai now. They live in Yonkers, and I don't know whether he does. He's probably single, I'm not sure, young guy.
yeah, they don't get married young anymore, right?
Although it's surprising that my granddaughter's class at Jewish Theological Seminary, a number of them met future partners there. She didn't, but some of them did.
Well, that's nice to know.
Yeah.
Ah.
Right. Yeah. Have you got anybody in mind for one of yours?
No.
Okay.
Well,
So are
thank
you
you.
finished? All right, I'm gonna
Yeah.
give you a cup of tea, or coffee, what would you like?